the second discussion item on our agenda, master plan next steps, M&P planning. Dr. De Silva, do you want to introduce this?
Yes, I will. So we are going to introduce Mike, who's going to be leading most of the conversation, but he is here with his partner, Pat Gallagher, who I think some of you have seen before. Joining Mike and Pat, we have Chuck Warrington from Colliers. You've met Chuck before, at least you have, Mr. Littman. I believe the entire strategic planning committee has met Pam Babuka and Bill Conti has been here as well, Studio Jade, and I'm just looking around the screen to make sure I didn't miss anyone. I have them all. So, Mike, do you think it's best that you begin and lead? I know, Pam, we had like a little question from one of our board members. Maybe we can get to that at the end if needed. Oh, you're
You
on mute.
can.
I've already transitioned that information over to Mike and it's incorporated into our presentation. So we'll hit that when we get there.
Thank you so much. Perfect.
Yep.
So I can get us kicked off. Morning, everybody. I see some familiar faces. I see a couple new faces, but I think we'll all get to know each other a little better throughout this process. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and kind of walk us through kind of what we have for our meeting today. And as Dr. Silva mentioned, I'm going to be tag teaming a lot of this with both Pat and Pam and Phil. So we'll be kind of passing the baton around a little bit as we work through it. So I always like to begin kind of have a table of contents for today's discussion. We'll have one for every discussion going forward as what we see kind of the major things that we want to be able to go through. So I know Pam more recently wrapped up her FCA findings. We're going to provide a recap, have a big picture on those. Back in, I think it was the end of October, we had presented the annual projection update, and we kind of sistered that with the capacity utilization. So Pat and I will be tag teaming those capacity as well as the utilization findings, just to everybody get a good base of knowledge. And then we'll start to kind of get into our master planning goals and priorities. I think, today's the first meeting kind of really getting into the fun part of it. You'll learn from working with us that we're very process driven. We have a approach that we find works very well for this to be able to kind of start big picture, narrow, but really kind of challenge you all as part of our key members, our committee and working group, to have a hand in really kind of the direction that the plan's going. And, that'll start with today's meeting, and we'll be leaving you with some homework to do as part of that. So, this is going to be a little bit of a commitment, but I think it's well worth it as we kind of work our way through this process overall. So, we always begin, I think people have different interpretations of what is a master plan. And, this is kind of our own little definition of it. We see it as a roadmap, right? It's that long-term framework. It encompasses everything educationally, operations, capital investments, really needs to align with your educational vision for the district. And it's a long-term document, but we always like to be able to note that, things happen, things change. It has to be rather malleable. So it's providing that roadmap, but it's not going to be rigid. What we always do is break it down into two components. And, unfortunately, the first component typically takes the longest, and that's what, the discovery phase there. And that's all of the assessment work. So that's enrollment projections, that's the capacity utilization that Pat and I wrapped up, last fall. Those are the FCAs that Pam and Phil have been working on and have recently wrapped up. And I know that energy analysis is kind of like hot off the presses there. They're putting the finishing touches on that. So all that collectively does is build our base of understanding. And we look to have, part of our process is our real goal is to have a truly informed committee. And when the committee is up to speed on the conditions, just like we are, just like those that are in the buildings every day, those that are managing the buildings, we could have really good conversation. We could have really good options. We could have really good decision making. Kind of the scope of work and what we're looking at is that tan colored box on the right of, this is where we're at now with the process. So this is kind of the fun part of being able to go through the journey here of developing those short and long-term planning recommendations. They can include a lot of different things. And, in our experience, each district, it's slightly different, but they all kind of go on that same process. But where you end up with from a findings, recommendations, and next step standpoint is always unique to you. So this could be in part, and it could be a combination of, each one of these. It's capital investment strategy, identifying some needs for programmatic expansion. It could yield a larger school construction program, and we use that term loosely. I know Jill just went over, a construction program, albeit of more of a targeted scale. That to us falls under that capital investment strategy. School construction program is something that would, probably garner, a referendum or public support on a project. Looking at something more aspirational, something larger scale, major renovations, renovate like new, build new facilities, and then kind of wrapping it up to, well, how do we get there? So a big part of that is going to be that master plan report, that implementation plan, where we're going to be laying out a timeline for that preferred plan, the steps along the way, as well as the necessary next steps. So, we leave you with the master plan, but also with that master plan, there's going to be items that you're going to want to reference back to that as that roadmap and say, okay, what do we need to tackle? When do we need to tackle it to stay in tune with this? And what are our different points in time that, we're going to have major actions? So, this really is a document that the way we kind of draft it and put it together, you're going to want to be picking up. You're going to want to be leveraging that, those FCAs, looking at what those capital needs are, looking at where we need to be able to target things annually for your budget, as well as being thoughtful of saying, hey, we need to now go out publicly for some support for a larger construction program, because here's where we're at in this process. This is another way of kind of breaking it down, and I provided a lot of details there. This is more so for the leave behind, just to get a good understanding of it, and for those that are at home that are watching or looking at the information, just so they kind of understand, what we're talking about. So simply put, enrollment projections, we do them annually for Ridgefield, been doing that for a number of years. Everything gets baked in from local demographics, what's happening in the housing market, what's being developed. It yields 10-year projections, both district-wide and school-specific by grade. The state requires that you have to have at least 8-year projections if you're going to submit a construction grant application. So even for things like vestibules, roofs, envelope projects, things that typically you wouldn't think need an enrollment projection, the state will be looking for those projections to be provided to be able to support those applications for reimbursement. Capacity utilization, which Pat will touch on in greater detail in a little bit. This was a lot of work over last summer. We worked hand in hand with the building principals over the summer, had them give us tours of their facilities, help us through questionnaires, getting an understanding of what's working, what's not working in the buildings, ultimately to identify what those educational needs are and what that program looks like for each of the grade levels in Ridgefield, and then identify space concerns. So, as part of the master planning process, it's like, do we have space challenges? Do we not? Where are they? Are they coming down the pipeline? So, are they not yet here yet and they're about to hit us? Do we have time? Do we have a surplus of space? We need to be thinking about how better can we repurpose those. So all of that information gets kind of codified in here, and that provides key guidance and parameters for as we're moving to those next steps on the right. You're familiar with Pam and Phil's work, Studio Jade on the facility conditions assessments. This is kind of everything in the building, what those needs look like, looking at each system, breaking down within those individual systems, what is the most immediate need, what are short term, what is long term, and how best do we plan around those needs. And we're thinking about that larger 10-year context for the master plan. So all three critical components takes a lot of effort to put together to get us to kind of where we're at today for those steps on the right. So as we move ahead, we always like to go and get into our site analysis, do a screening of sites in town. So actually pulling together mapping, looking at the physical sites, saying, do we have opportunities for expansion? Do we have opportunities for construction on these sites? Or are we kind of, for lack of a better term, are we penned in a little bit, So we'll go through each of the building sites, identify, are there any logical areas that make sense? Should we want to expand here? We'll also do a site screening for sites across the town. We'll leverage the state guidance. They put out documentation of, what they would typically look for for building a new school. We'll compare our existing sites against that, but we'll also screen town-owned as well as private properties across the community to see, hey, do we have any sites that would meet those criteria from access, buildability standpoint? Are these, opportunities for a new school? Should we go in that direction? We're not saying that we need to go in that direction, but what this does is this kind of narrows down our realm of possibilities. And then as we get into that master planning, which is the really good part of what we're going to be working on, a bulk of our meetings together is really kind of looking at, our initial pass on those options. So we like to start big picture. We like to be able to put out ideas of, do we want to talk grade reconfiguration? Do we want to talk expansion of programming? Do we want to talk about, providing additional space at such and such? We're able to be able to work through that, look at the pros and cons. This will be part of our conversation as well today, where we talk about criteria. We'll talk about planning goals. And we really kind of try to narrow it down to where we're looking at a handful of options, right? That we really want to take a look at, where we're going to get into some more concept level block diagrams, looking at, hey, we could put an expansion here. We can build over here. It's going to be X amount of square foot. Here's the cost. Here's the cost to the town. All of those key elements are going to be very important, but we'll start big, and our whole goal is to be able to narrow, narrow, narrow. And then last but not least, where we get into that report documentation and implementation, right now, we don't know what it's going to say. So, we don't know what the findings are. And that's, I think, the fun part of the journey of this process is that, we're taking all the body of work that's been done, we're going to work our way through it and determine what are the next steps. And then as part of those next steps, it's going to be timeline, implementation. Do we require other information as part of that? Do we need to do a more detailed feasibility, getting some, really detailed concepts together to say, hey, this definitely works. Here's a cost estimate, and then ultimately lead us into that grant application? Or is it going to be, how best do we want to fund the capital improvement plan? How best do we break it down? How best do we tackle it? What is the best way to be able to group projects together? Those are all options on the table at this point in time. So kind of getting right into kind of that recap, and I'm going to take it as a recap here. I know we presented it, but it's been a number of months now. Every fall we do an enrollment projection update for the last since the Great Recession back in 2007, 2008. We started doing high, medium, and low models that really helped us when the pandemic hit. It's a planning for uncertainty, but I think it also is a planning exercise and a projection tool for when you're looking at building options, you're looking at expansion, contraction, anything in a master plan. You now have 3 sets of numbers to be able to test them against. So when we do this, our low model is always our pessimistic model. In the first 5 years, the projections are always fairly well banded, but things like housing and migration, movement, markets, economy, student movement, all have bearing on projections. So we have that low, more pessimistic model or medium model, which reflects really the recent trends over the last several years. And then our high model, which is saying, hey, if things move in a certain direction, we're seeing elevated housing turnover, housing and migration, maybe a couple of the projects that have been talked about in the community finally pop. This is the direction the projections are going to go. So even though we update it annually, the 3 different models really represent that realm of possibilities. I think the important thing is to kind of look at where we're at within that realm of possibilities. When you look at, the projections, really not much different than where you've been recently. So even in the high model, it's getting back to where you were in, right around the onset of COVID, around 4,500 students. The medium model puts us really kind of on par with where our trends have been leading over the last couple of years, and then that low model drops us down to a slightly lower enrollment. And this is just to look at it from a disaggregated by our grade grouping. So on the bottom of the stack bar chart is that K-5 enrollment. We're projecting it to increase by about 5%, averaging about 1,840 students overall. The way we kind of look at it, we'll pick around that planning midpoint. Typically we'll follow, especially when we're doing the more detailed analysis, we'll look at that 8-year peak projected enrollment. So if we're looking at an elementary school project, that peak projected enrollment within that 8-year window would be right at that 1,897 mark. We would then use an individual school enrollment for that, and so on and so forth. We're looking at the middle school. It's projected to average about 1,000 students overall, but you have enrollment fluctuations as bigger cohorts move up into the middle, up into the high school. Some smaller cohorts come in. You have a little bit of a dip, and then you get a little bit of a rebound. And then the high school overall is projected to decline by about 7%, but still average about 1,400 students over the next decade. And then getting into the individual elementary school projections. So, we really look at the first 5 years for individual elementary schools. A lot of things happen. You're a neighborhood-based school system, and when we say that, some of them are larger neighborhoods than others based on where they're at in town. But by and large, you're a community that groups by address. You group by geography, so you're at the whim of folks moving in and out of the community. And we do know that, within Ridgefield, for having worked here for a number of years, that when you see families move into community, we see typically, families with a number of children. So, a few housing sales here or there can have a pretty big impact from year to year. So we really kind of look at that first 5 years within our planning window, and then realize in the latter half, we're starting to lose students. So the first 5 years, we have students in seats, for lack of a better term, and we have no known births. As we get to years 5 and 10, we start to lose those knowns, and we're relying a little bit more on assumptions. But overall, you could see that, we have 4 of our schools projected to grow modestly, anywhere from 3 to 5%, over the first 5 years. And then we have Scotland and Veterans Park, really stable enrollment, modest declines at about 2% over those first 5 years. And then you have some dips and bumps throughout, and that's just typical demographics within smaller populations. So, we're going to really rely on this data as we start breaking down and looking at what the space needs are, which Pat will talk about. But then ultimately, when we get into those master planning options, start talking about, how does the enrollment fit the building? Do we have space concerns? Is there better ways that we can be able to handle that? And we'll start layering in other information as well. So, as I take a break and grab a drink, I'm going to pass the baton to Pat to walk us through our space analysis for the elementary schools.
Thanks, Mike.
And actually, Pat, if I could just pause us for 1 second.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zuba. I just want to check in. That was a lot of information. I just want to see if any members have clarifying questions at this point on what's been presented, or if we should just move on. Anybody want to chime in, have a clarifying question, or need more information?
Sure.
Mr. Martieri?
I have a question, and maybe we're going to cover this later. So, Mike, this is very helpful. I'm sure you do this internally, but one of the things that would help us is if we actually have, something that shows here's the milestones that we need to meet, and here's, when we expect to achieve them, and then have an understanding of when the actual completion date is for when the master plan will start coming, for us to review. Is that something that we're going to be developing and sharing, or is already developed and can be shared?
I have a last slide where I talk about our next steps that lays out a schedule. I had some certainty on the schedule because you have meetings set through the end of this fiscal year in June, and then I was planning on having a chat on meeting over the summer and setting some dates. But ultimately, good question, and we're looking at having a final presentation probably early fall. It's gonna. I wish I could say we could do this in 2 months and go quick. But it's really a little bit of a longer process for it.
Sure. Yeah, and you're right on the point that I'm on, and that is, okay, I'm concerned about, I shouldn't say concerned, but what I'm interested in is what you're actually looking for us to do by when, to kind of help bring this thing all together. So, just making us aware of all of that.
You're eager to get your homework in. We're going to go through that today. So,
yeah, great.
Well, what we've learned is that Mr. Materi has an eagle eye for sure, which will be very helpful.
Yeah, and you'll learn, like, kind of rolling through the process with us too, of like, we want to make sure that this is done right. We want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. We know we're going to have differences in opinion along the way, and we want to have enough meetings to be able to discuss, resolve, and work our way through those. Because ultimately, you're kind of the group of ambassadors there that are helping us kind of work our way through, vet them. But ultimately, we're going to have a rationale in place as we go out to the community with this as well. So we want you to be as educated as we are if possible, in this process.
Okay.
And I know we want to move on, so I won't belabor it, but one of the most I think powerful points that you shared with me in one of our planning meetings when I was throwing all these ideas at you, and you said, like, hold the line here, because that process is really what is the most valuable. Because if you don't work through all of the elements that you saw in those prior slides, and you're going to see from this point forward, you might end up taking 10 steps back rather than 10 steps forward. So I appreciate that insight that you gave me, especially when I was very much ready to just keep moving, keep moving, keep moving.
Yeah, and
Mr. Marcheri, I think you will, just because you're newer to the board, and same with the other newer members, that enrollment that Mr. Zuba just shared, that is important when you're thinking about future decisions, because it's not, you can't just think about right now, right? You have to think about how that enrollment could potentially change and or increase, right? When you're looking at an 4.9% increase or whatever it is over the next 10 years, what that really means for our schools, whether it's 1, 6, or 3. So there you go. Sorry.
no, and this is all good, and I think a key of two is board members. We assume that everybody has the same knowledge of facilities, enrollment, programs. That's never the case. So if you're stuck on something and we want you to understand it, and we want you to have, the same understanding that we have, just ask a question. We're going to keep kind of moving through things, but if you're stuck on something, just interrupt us and we'll be glad to go back, work our way through it. We have an hour and a half today, which is plenty of time to do what we need to do. So don't sit there in silence.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Mr. Gallagher, do you want to drive us forward?
Sure. Good morning, everybody.
Mr. Lippin,
Oh, I'm
Mr.
sorry.
Lippin, this is Catherine. If I
Yes,
could,
Ms. Kraft, please. Yeah, go ahead.
question on this
Please.
one.
Yes, please do.
Hey, thank you so much for this presentation. Looking through it, I love kind of starting big picture and then diving in carefully. As I look at the enrollment, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but essentially, we've been looking through actuals versus the historical median projections, generally pretty accurate, which is great. As we look at this kind of master plan, I'm curious how we are incorporating the A school and preschool projections into this plan.
Very, very good question. So, in our experience in Connecticut, since we do not have universal pre-K, pre-K becomes a number that we plan around. So, as we kind of work our way through this process, we're going to be talking about ideas of, do we want to expand pre-K? What are the benefits of it? What are the considerations space-wise for it? We typically will just carry the size of your program forward for pre-K in our projections. And if you have a planned expansion, we'll build that number into it and then work that into the capacity utilization to see what that means. But now is the time to start thinking, at least, about what is the future of pre-K from a Ridgefield Public School standpoint. And the same can be said for some of your special programs as well. That becomes a little bit different. Alt ed becomes almost like, what is the historic need for that typically? And we could buffer around that a little bit more for space planning. But pretty much those are a little bit different than, say, where we're projecting for Farmingville Elementary School, or I'm projecting for East Ridge. That's really kind of a demographic modeling exercise.
Yeah, and just to add on one little quick piece is on the alternative high school / 18 to 22, the new building Prospect Ridge is not a part of this particular study, obviously, because it's not built. And also, Ms. Graff, so when it comes to A school students, they are in the high school enrollment. So because we don't necessarily know which students may transition into A school or not, if that makes sense.
Okay, yes, that's very helpful. And I guess from my own perspective, I think it's critical that we do include some placeholder for preschool, given they are currently housed in our elementary schools and has, I think, a pretty profound impact on our spacing as we look at this master plan. So that's just my own 2 cents.
No, that's, you're spot on. And Pat will talk through that, and you can see where we kind of have it built into our capacity. But it was last week or this week just for your alternative ed, you may want to consider doing what some other districts do, where they assign a different facility code, gives a unique facility code with the state on that, where you can then track that enrollment separately. Where rather than having Richfield High School facility code tagged in a state database, it'll have your alternative ed facility code tagged, and that way you can start building an historic record easily of what that program looks like for planning purposes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, Pat, are you almost ready? We gave you an extended break here.
That's all right. All right. Good morning, everybody. So our capacity and utilization study was really tasked at looking at how well positioned your buildings were to accommodate your educational program as well as any projected enrollment growth. And we always like to say that your capacity is dynamic and it changes as the way you educate changes. You're a community like many of our communities in Connecticut, where many of your buildings were built, 50, 60 years ago, when education was very different. We didn't have the large special education population we have today. We didn't have, pre-K embedded in our schools. We didn't have all of these support services. And so it was really looking at, how can we accommodate not just K-5 instruction at the elementary schools, but all of the different support services and specials that are needed for our modern education today. And we can kind of move through the next slide. So we went through an exercise where we marked up floor plans, met with the building leadership, inventoried spaces, and we used your maximum loading levels with a discounting of about 15%, because we know in neighborhood-based schools, the kids don't come neatly packed, at your grade maximums across all the grades. And so having a deduction there kind of builds in that headroom and also aligns more with your staffing model. We also made deductions when schools had spaces that didn't align with that educational program. And so there were a number of deductions we made where we had insufficient number of small and medium-sized spaces, where we may have had, numerous staff in a small office space. We also made deductions at a number of schools because they did not have full-size maker spaces. Some schools, I believe it was Barlow Mountain and Ridgeberry, had nice dedicated maker spaces adjacent to the media center. Other buildings, we had it simply on a cart within the media center. And so again, we wanted our capacity to be really a parity exercise across the board that said if all Ridgefield Public School buildings were providing all of those spaces in ideal locations, this is what the capacity would be. Going through this exercise, we identified that over the next 5 years, most of your buildings are going to be operating at between 85 and 100% of your planning capacity. And the planning capacity, again, is not the maximum number of kids that could hypothetically fit, but a comfortable ideal operations that reflects comfortable class sizes. I believe we used about 19 per classroom as our baseline, and then provides all the spaces for support services. A couple of things we'll note: Farmingville, we are projecting to exceed 100% of the planning capacity, and Barlow Mountain and Branchville really approaching 100%, with some individual years at both of those buildings exceeding 100%. And what that means isn't necessarily that the school is bursting at the seams, but rather what it means is that we are going to continue to likely have some of those support services in those less than ideal spaces. We're going to continue to have multiple specialists sharing space. We're going to continue to have the maker space on a cart in the media center, because at the end of the day, we know K-5 instruction is going to be the top priority when you're doing your space planning. What this also tells us, though, is that you have very limited room district-wide to expand programs. And to build off of Catherine's comment before, if we want to grow pre-K in the elementary schools, we really don't have the physical space to do so. And so as we get into that master planning phase, it'll be an exercise of starting to look at those options of, where can we leverage, building additions or new construction to provide that space to provide those services.
Yeah, and Pat, really quick before we go on, and we're saying kind of requirements. So this is something that we work through, and you'll note what requires a full-size classroom. So, those are shown in that teal color. And that's kind of what we're striving towards. We realize that in a given year, if you have a bubble or something unforeseen happens, that you may deviate from that. But like when we're looking at the larger 10-year window, this is where, based on what we're seeing in the current program, this is kind of your operational model going forward. And we also provided a more detailed version of this. This is just a recap. So if you want to dig in where those flex rooms or where those deductions were made, we've provided a version to the district that has all of that information in it. It's a very long slide deck. It has color-coded floor plans in it to be able to kind of roll your sleeves up and get into that. Encourage you to do so if you want to be able to kind of dive into that level of understanding. It would probably be important to have that little piece of homework, complete it before we get into kind of those options. Nothing you need to jump into right now, but pick it up, take a go through. We do the same for the enrollment projections. You really want to kind of get into the details there. That's there. This is just a kind of get you up to speed recap. All right, Pat.
All right. So this is just kind of a recap. I won't belabor what I've already said, other than, we're really operating close to our maximum in the high school in terms of aligning with your educational model. And so, again, as we look at options for the future, how can we better position facilities to have all of the spaces that you need for, 2025 and beyond? The biggest challenge is when your buildings were built, it had, a lot of full-size classrooms and not a lot of offices and spaces for support services. And so as those services have grown, those spaces are starting to, have to locate within full-size classrooms, which then allows for fewer full-size classrooms to be used for K-5 instruction. All right, so getting into the middle schools, we are projecting some decrease in enrollment at the middle school over the next 5 years before it's projected to rebound. We know over the last few years, the district's been dealing with some imbalance in enrollment between Scotts Ridge and East Ridge. We are projecting a decline across both middle schools, but we are projecting that Scotts Ridge is going to remain the larger of the two middle schools for the foreseeable future. And we went through the same exercise at the middle school level, but middle school is very different than the elementary school because everything's organized around the team-based model. And then we also have a larger number of specials that students will cycle into throughout the day. As Mike noted before, we've highlighted the uses that need full-size classrooms in that teal color. And we also have a number of other uses like resource rooms, which are embedded within the teams, as well as OTPT and self-contained rooms that are included in the capacity as well. So our capacities at Scotts Ridge and East Ridge, we have currently the same number of teams across both schools. However, East Ridge does have some additional classroom spaces that are used for support services. Or could be used, to accommodate an enrollment bubble. But so that building is slightly larger than Scotts Ridge. It also has more generously sized core spaces, bigger auditorium, gym, cafeteria. And we're projecting that overall utilization is going to be at about 84%, about 80 to 84% on the high end to about 75% on the low end before rebounding to near current levels. Scotts Ridge is going to continue to be tight over the next couple of years before getting back to a more comfortable level of about 85% by the midpoint, rebounding to about 94% in the 10 years. Whereas East Ridge is going to continue to operate at a lower level at about 66% at the low point, rebounding to about 73%. And so again, I think one of the conversations is going to be what's the best approach to dealing with the middle school. At this point, it's really going to be more of a class size exercise. Being a more well-utilized school at Scotts Ridge means that we're going to have larger class sizes than East Ridge, where we have lower utilization. So what's the best approach there? Is it looking at ways of kind of rebalancing the two schools? Is it looking at other options to make Scotts Ridge a little more comfortable? And then the high school, we are projecting enrollment to stay relatively stable over the next 5 years and then decrease over the latter years of the projections as some of those smaller elementary cohorts move up, with enrollment decreasing to under 1,300 students by year 9. And we've also pulled out the transition program and out of district placements, knowing that those students are not attending the high school or won't be attending the high school in the future. So that's where we've accounted for the transition program as well in 12th grade. And again, similar exercise to the elementary and middle schools. Here, the core subjects really drive our capacity as well as scheduling. So at the high school, we know that you have the collaborative workrooms for all of the core subjects. So teachers aren't required to own their classrooms because they can take their planning periods in collaborative workrooms. So we've provided a scheduling factor of about 80%, which means that each classroom is used about 80% of the time, and the other 20% it'll be empty just given the scheduling. And we also have a number of specials, visual arts, music, tech ed, consumer science, etc., that also require full-size spaces. And many of these are kind of more purpose-built laboratory type spaces that have been designed for the unique elements of the program. And we are looking at a current utilization of about 73% at the high school, averaging about 75% over the next 5 years, and then decreasing to about 70% over the later years of the projections. So space is not going to be a concern at the high school. It's going to be more about aligning the spaces with your current curriculum. Working with the building leadership there, we've identified a number of spaces that would benefit from being modernized and repurposed to better align with how you teach today. The wood and metal shop, robotics lab, a garage space, greenhouse, and some of the spaces that support your music and performing arts programs.
All right.
Can I ask a question there, actually?
Sure.
So we are separately considering an auditorium project at the high school that would impact, as you just mentioned, obviously our performing arts, music, and performing arts programming. Are we thinking about that in this context as well? If we were to move forward with that parallel project, would that free up existing spaces that are being used currently, or how should we think about that parallel analysis that's happening for that particular potential improvement to the high school physical plan?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to, you have the physical space, and as your conceptual design advances, it is kind of taking that more holistic view of the spaces that are adjacent to it, and are there opportunities to modernize some of those spaces? I know the stagecraft spaces, I think, are right near the auditorium, and seeing how those could potentially be rolled into the project as well. So for the high school, I think it's less about the amount of physical space and more about how you're using it, and does it best align with how the instruction is occurring now.
And Pat, I'll just add to that, and I'll probably take a little bit of a PAM approach to it as well, of where you're looking at that project. You also want to reference back to the FCAs for the high school to say, do we have any outstanding short-term or even midterm capital needs system-wide that we need to be able to address within that area of the building, where rather than it just being a modernization project for that program, is there some items of critical need there in the building that we want to touch on, as well as we're going through and disrupting some of those spaces. And I leave the big picture takeaways to you, Pat, and then we could pass
Sure.
off the pen.
Yeah, so to kind of summarize the last few slides, we're projecting some modest elementary growth over the next decade, driven by some larger cohorts we anticipate entering kindergarten over the next few years. And really, the elementary schools are operating close to that 100% of the planning capacity, with really limited opportunities to add new programs or expand pre-K within the existing buildings. On the middle school side, we're projecting declines in enrollment in the near term before rebounding over the latter years of the projections. And while we anticipate having enough physical space within the two middle schools, we are anticipating that Scotts Ridge will remain tight, and it will continue to be larger than East Ridge. So again, something we're putting in the parking lot for future discussion as we get into the master planning phase. And then at the high school, again, no capacity concerns over the foreseeable future, so it'll be more of an exercise of modernizing the spaces to better align with current needs.
All right. All right. We'll just kind of pause and see if there's any other capacity utilization space questions that the committee has, and if none, we could kind of move on and Pam could recap our FCAs.
Mr. Martucci?
Yeah, I have one question of clarification, Pat, and thank you for this. This is very helpful. I didn't quite understand when you were talking about, the point deductions as it relates to the utilization. I think I got the sense that it's really to try to normalize the look among the schools.
Exactly.
But how do I think about that, in the out years for a particular school? So, for example, if I recall, Scotland might be like at 90% utilization in the out years. Is that saying that if you look at what we currently do in Scotland and we continue to do in Scotland, we're at 90% utilization? Or, are we factoring into some areas of Scotland that we might have small spaces that really aren't utilized properly? And if they were used properly, it would be 90%. Could you just kind of help me understand that?
Sure. So great question. So for a school like Scotland, we didn't make any deductions for programmatic deficiencies, I believe. Let me take a look at my notes. But you make the deductions, to your point, to kind of level set all the schools across the board. You don't want one school to be having a dedicated full-size makerspace and another school to be having it in the library. A school like Scotland, 90% capacity is likely means that all of your existing K-5 classrooms that are in use today will continue to be in use. And it's not going to change the need for any of the support services because those are kind of in place regardless of whether you have 250 students or 300 students. You're still going to need to provide all of those spaces. Where it starts to become more of a challenge is in the buildings where we identified you're starting to exceed 100%. And what that means is that there's a chance that we're going to need additional K-5 classroom space over the next 5 to 10 years. And when that happens, other people are going to be displaced, and the building leaders are going to have to continue to play this musical chairs exercise of finding appropriate accommodations for all of the special education and support services. A lot of districts kind of have that management approach. If you're just kind of teetering just above that 100% mark, and once we start to exceed 110%, that's when we're really looking at more long-term. It's going to be a challenge to find the spaces for the support services as well without having kind of detrimental impact to education.
Got it. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you for that.
And Pat, that's a great point. And I think something I'll point out too is when we were walking through the buildings, I believe it was late June, early July, somewhere around that time frame. Scotland was a good example of moving spaces around, right? Like actively looking of how best. Here's our registrations. Here's our projected enrollment. We're moving a book room. We're doing these other things around to be able to put the uses that need the most appropriate space within the most appropriate spaces. So musical chairs is a great way to describe it because, as we've codified at a point in time of, hey, this is what the uses are, but you may come back 2 years later and say, okay, now we've shifted around a little bit because when you're operating in your 90 percentile of your utilization, you're making decisions to be able to move spaces around. You don't have the luxury of saying, set it and forget it. We have the right spaces. We have a flex room, right? If you had a flex classroom, then a flex classroom is a room that there's never an empty room, right? It's always something to use, but that can accommodate a bubble. If you had the luxury of a flex classroom, you're not playing as much musical chairs with moving programs around every year. But it's a great indication of what you have in totality of the building and how you're operating, and less emphasis on the exact location of where everything is in the building, I think is a good way to look at it.
Sure.
Pam, you're
Thank
up.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
If I may have one question.
Okay.
Sorry, guys, I know I'm on the phone. This is Catherine Graff. One comment. I'd like to echo Mr. Lippman's point he had earlier about the high school auditorium and considering the implications of having capital projects running in parallel to our master planning process, especially to the extent that such projects are significant that we as a committee, I hope we can integrate being mindful of before we invest in these capital projects that it aligns generally even with our draft master planning to ensure our dollars are used effectively and efficiently. That's just a comment. And I have one question kind of along those lines, and it might be a down the road thing, just to ensure that we integrate this into our timeline of master plan, is coordinating with our other tri-board members to ensure that we're thinking about, from a broad town perspective, our utilization of our buildings, and if there's opportunities for us to work with them on other potentials outside of our current education buildings. Is something that is at least worth a meeting from my perspective to ensure that we are being most effective with it. So I guess 2 comments for the group. Thanks.
Ms. Graff, if you don't mind, if I can just jump in really quick. To answer your first question around the high school auditorium, I think we have to just remind ourselves that that auditorium is in the out years. So the goal obviously would be to, exactly as you and Mr. Lippman describe, is not to have one project be well on its way and we're still over here talking about the high school auditorium through a very different lens, right? Potentially through a different lens, because we're still in that master planning process. So I want to be sure that we're reminded that the high school auditorium, I think we're now 3 years out, and naturally that can be pushed out even further if it's necessary to do so, or if the board agrees that that should happen. And then your second point around the town partnership, Mike, you could probably talk a little bit about how you've seen that in terms of process and when that becomes an important piece to bring those individuals in, because no one, I think, disagrees on this call that that's important, so that we're all on the same page. And what I think I noticed, Mike, in your earlier slides, like your section of the slides, you looked at the intent is to look at not just the school properties, but other accessible properties within the community potentially, right? And I even thought I heard the word private properties. I don't want to scare people, but that type of language.
Yeah, we're not going to look at other town buildings to reuse those, but town properties, if there's development opportunities on them, we want to be able to screen them as such to see if they're it's kind of the no stone unturned approach, right? If we, who knows, we end up talking about building a school, right? If it turns out that we end up talking about some kind of configuration change, building a school or any of the like, is there anything even out there that can accommodate a project of that type before we go down the road of even talking about it, right? Like as a real possibility. So yeah, it's important to be able to look at that from a realm of possibility standpoint. And really kind of from our experience, it becomes a partnership once we believe it's, the board, the district education kind of leads the options first of saying, hey, this is what we need to do to support what we're doing educationally here. And I think, it becomes almost like a multi-pronged equation for the board of saying, how best do we keep our facilities in a state of good repair? That they're in the condition and providing the programming that's expected of Ridgefield Public Schools. And then you look at the town side and start bringing them into the conversation of saying, hey, here's where we're at to support what we're trying to do. We recognize that there may be other town needs out there that require bonding as well. So it becomes a balance of saying, if we're looking at capital expenditures, what are the town's capital expenditures? How does this fit within that? And then it's trying to get broader support for the plan itself and for what that investment strategy looks like and having transparency there. But we believe kind of the process is, the working group as constituted now to be able to kind of narrow down what works best to either an option or options. And then that's when you begin to engage others within the community.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. I think that's very helpful context, and I think important that we keep on our radar so that we can coordinate with our, especially Board of Finance, Board of Select people, as it relates to debt services and things of this nature as we get further along. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Ms. Graff. Ms. Babuka, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, let's jump back in and get a recap of the assessment. So this slide just provides a real high-level overview of kind of like the charge and what our scope covered. So it is a 10-year forecast of capital renewal and improvement needs. And again, we were looking at the buildings in their existing conditions, and we were looking at them, how they were currently being used, right? So Mike and Pat have both talked about program and how things are being delivered it doesn't influence us one way or another if the space is not fully meeting, if it's adequate or inadequate. We're just looking at the buildings as they exist and what those conditions are, and what are the costs that it's going to take in order to be able to maintain them in the next 10 years to function as they are today. Okay, so just putting a box around that. Our scope included 11 buildings, which was 6 elementaries, 2 middles, 1 high. There were 2 athletic support buildings that we also evaluated that were on the high school property itself. The total estimated gross square footage was just over 1 million square feet. And in that process, we went through a detailed standards review, which was kind of a continuous process. We conducted the on-site assessments. We did a deep dive on the cost estimating approach, and then we have gone through findings and analysis process. That's big picture. All right, this slide provides kind of a more graphical summary of our findings. Okay, so there's on the left-hand side, there's again a recap of the specifics. Your years of construction that we evaluated, those buildings range from 1955 to 2003 for their original constructed years, with years that exceed that for renovations. And then ultimately, our assessments were conducted between October and the end of November. So that all being said, the top box, and all of these numbers right here are based off of all the buildings that we assessed collectively and how it breaks down, right? So this is for the project. The 4 tiers of priorities were priority 1 within 1 year, priority 2 within 3, priority 4 with 3 within 5, and priority 4 within 10 years. So all the data is grouped and categorized in that manner. When you look at that spread, it totals the $197.5 million. And what is helpful to understand, and this is really interesting, the pie chart to the right, it's kind of unusual for us to see the chart to be so steady in this manner. But you can see the first 3 years, it almost identically is 33% across the board, right? So 66% between for priority 3 and 6 and 5 together, right? And then the 10 years. So that's a really interesting dynamic. Now, at a building level, across those 10 years, those waves could be at different places, right? But this is collectively across all of those buildings. The section below is a summary of what the totals were based off of primary building systems. So first of all, the top one is building envelope and structure. For just general reference, that is if you were to skin the building. So it's the exterior walls, windows, doors, and roof. All right. So that's the structure and the structure itself. You can see that came up, and that's shown in the orange bar at 16%, 16.6. Architectural interiors and finishes is everything on the inside, right? So whether that's a wall that needs to be repaired, but it could be ceilings, floors, walls, any type of finishes, but that also would include if we have a section where we needed to have handrails that needed to be repaired or replaced, anything that's related to an architectural interior component. Elevators and lifts are pretty explanatory. Mechanical and plumbing as well. That's your infrastructure and all the individual pieces of equipment itself. Fire alarm and fire protection, we group them together, even though recognize that fire alarm is technically part of the electrical system. We do pull that out. And then the protection part is the sprinkler side. We grouped everything else, electrical tech and security together, and finally site improvements. What this shows, and it's really evident in the colored chart to the right, is that the primary system where the most amount of dollars needs to be invested, where the improvement needs are, is your mechanical plumbing, district-wide across 10 years, right? Behind that is the interior architectural interiors, and behind that is the building envelope. Now, in general, our approach when we look at these things is it's important that our buildings are warm, safe, and dry. And so the building envelope and the mechanical and plumbing systems are 2 of the primary things that we have to look at to maintain those features of a building, of what we expect of our building at a minimum. Next slide. Okay, this has been updated, and thank you for the board member who noticed that the numbers were not pulled through all the way. This is a building analysis by priority. The analysis table actually it was built off of was correct, but it hadn't refreshed with their updated numbers. So this is correct, and I have issued updated reports to Dr. De Silva this morning, and she'll make sure she passes these specific reports to the rest of the team. What you will see is when we evaluate things by priority, this is kind of expanding on that top chart on the previous slide. We're really not paying attention to how we're really looking at how many dollars are requested, the most amount of dollars are requested by which building, right? So it's not about what, it's about where. So if we were to just look at where are the most number of priority 1 recommended improvements within year 1, within 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years, this helps us understand where that is. But ultimately, and this is ordered and organized alphabetically, okay? And so this helps us see that breakdown. What I did add on this chart compared to the previous one is originally to the right, we showed the subtotal by building of years 0 to 5, and we had a column of years 6 to 10. I added, for reference, the total need by building, so we could still see the alignment of the dollars to the right is the exact same number that you're going to see on that individual detailed assessment report. And then it also gave us a means to see the total, which is the 197, 538, 262. Okay. Are there any questions on this report before I go to the next one, since this one is different than the previous? Okay. The next slide is for us from a planning perspective, as far as talking about next steps. This one is the most impactful because it helps us not just know the where, but the what. And the buildings are no longer organized alphabetically, right? So the information on the left-hand side is the same, and they are still grouped by elementary, middle, and high. But if you now go to the tan column on the right side, we have now sorted these based off of which one has the total building cost per gross square footage, all right? So in this calculation, we don't consider the dollars associated to a site. And that's because a particular site may have extraordinary needs or nothing. And that really doesn't speak to the building needs themselves. They're real dollars and they're listed in your report. But from this purview, we take those out so we can, 1, normalize what we're looking at. Number 2, we also evaluate this based off of these collective systems. So you can see we group things and they're the same as what was in that chart on the bottom side. But we're now looking at them and normalizing what's that cost for mechanical systems based off of the square footage of this building. All right. So now, if we were just to look at the dollars, there may be more dollars required to be spent at the high school because it's a very big building. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the dollars per square foot are relative to the dollars required in other locations. So if we just looked at that one piece, you can see at Ridgefield High School, and you go over to mechanical and plumbing, and you see $77.79. That's the average cost per square foot required for improvements based off of the square footage of that building. So we've normalized it. Now, if you go up and you go to Scotland Elementary School, that is only a 52,000 square foot building, but the needs at that building push it to $200 a square foot. And that's what helps us really evaluate where the improvements need to be made and what that looks like. So this is very informative to help us analyze this as we're going into next steps and option development, where it's appropriate or inappropriate to consider other options. Any questions on that slide? Okay.
Yeah, I guess, well, just the reference to your reference to other options. Do we want to wait until kind of our charge and next steps and homework to
Yes.
what lens we should be thinking about this through? But clearly we're kind of, there's elephants in the room. that we're not saying out loud, whether it's consolidation or redistricting or things like
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
Well, and this just informs it, right? So, but it does help us understand, Mike and Pat provided what do we know is current and what's projected from building use and overall utilization and that piece of it. This provides a really solid understanding of what are your needs to capital improvements if no program and other thing was there. So that's another big chunk, right? So two different pairs of sunglasses that we're looking at, but we put them all together to really look at what your programmatic driven desires are, how you want to teach and how you want to deliver that education and what types of spaces. We fleshed all of that out, and that's part of the next step. So thank you for that clarification.
Mr. Siegel, did I see you come off
Pam,
mute? I don't know.
think you did a
Yeah,
sorry.
echoing my thoughts, I'm
Right.
I'm holding off until we do big picture takeaways because I think we have similar questions. So I'm gonna wait.
Okay, great. Mr. Zuba.
Okay, great. Pam, I think you covered almost every one of these. This is just our leave behind, but that last bullet, I want us to think about that. And I think that's where several of us are kind of going already, but let's hold off on that. But there's different ways to approach facility needs, right? Is it you follow an FCA, you address your most critical needs, based on the timing of the needs, but also realize that approach is kind of limited, as Pam mentioned, to kind of what's already physically within the building. We're not talking about modern educational environments. That becomes more of a replacement approach. So just when we always talk about FCAs and FCA needs, and we always remind everybody that we don't know what they are right now, but there's two different ways to be able to tackle building needs, just in the back of our mind right now.
Mike, before
yeah.
we go forward, Dr. De Silva did ask me to give a brief comment about, we had a meeting yesterday with our energy and sustainability team, and feel free to jump in if there's something that you want to add. But we had a really deep dive into what those components are, and every time I go through that process, I feel like I learned something new because it's always changing and it's evolving. But in that process, and a report has not been issued yet. We have a couple of pieces dated that we're nailing down and working with Mr. Moritz on. And once that's out, the report will be issued. But bottom line is we went through and it was shared about how in the industry we utilize an energy use intensity factor. It's a way to normalize all the different types of fuels, whether it's fossil fuels and electric, so we can look at them uniformly and understand the energy footprint of each building. And in doing so, it did confirm, as did your assessment, that your building systems, your HVAC building systems are not energy efficient. So there's an opportunity there, just in general, based off of the equipment. The biggest factor being the lack of building controls and the different variations of ages of pieces of equipment, which is something that we can address moving forward. But one thing that was a big positive that came from the energy analysis that will be pointed out is that you currently have and have been investing in photovoltaics, and they are making a very significant and very positive output of energy that is positively impacting your energy. And if we can get that paired with better, more efficient equipment and controls, you guys will be really doing great things. But a lot came from that. More is to come. I just wanted to make sure I kind of covered that briefly. Is there anything else, Dr. De Silva, you wanted to add?
No, so we spent about 2 hours with Pam and her colleague yesterday, and there was so much information. And we will send you the report again as those couple of pieces get collected and that becomes finalized. I do think though, Pam, and we could talk about this offline, that it would be helpful for the board to hear directly from you all, because I don't think the report could actually articulate, nor could I certainly cannot articulate the information that was shared. And I think that that's pretty powerful based on what I heard yesterday. And I know I've been hearing from the town partners around costs and trying to look at sustainability over time and where can we find some. So again, we could talk offline about that, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Absolutely, we're totally willing to do that.
Great. Mr. Martiri.
Yes, thank you, Pamela. This is very helpful as well. This might be a question really more for Dr. De Silva or Ms. Brown, but when we look at capital, the way it's presented here, is it the same definition as capital as we have, or are there some what we would call operational activities in here as well?
So that's a great question. Mr. Moritz is on the line because he could speak about the way in which Pam and Joe looked at it. But well, let me have them speak to it and then I'll jump in. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, good morning, everybody. Yeah, the capital is we look at both strategically out in the out years, of course, and we look at what is operationally above a threshold for a normal operating expense. So that's kind of it. As we move forward with Pam and her group, there'll be much more strategic thinking in developing the capital plan.
I think your question, though, Rob, is whether or not those operational items that are currently in the operational budget connected to facilities are here as well. Is that what your question is?
Yeah, so we're talking about a span of $197 million over 10 years. I mean, are we saying this is what the capital plan will be, or some of this 197 would really be what we would consider to be operational over the course of those 10 years?
I'm sorry, yeah, definitely. So we still need to parse out the capital projects, the capital improvements, and in that total report, there are a number of projects that would be handled on the operational side going forward.
Okay, great. Because that's something that I think would be very helpful when I think about next steps going forward as well.
And also, just Mr. Martiri, there is a definition that we use when we plan for capital, and we can send that to you in terms of what it is that goes on a capital plan versus an operating, because that will help clarify, I think, a little bit of this.
Yeah, no, I'm good with that. I was just wanted to make sure I understood what we're talking about here. So that's good. Just another question on the fire level safety study that was done. I'm thinking that our fire department comes in and looks at the schools on a regular basis as well.
Correct.
Have they done that? And is what they found consistent with the report? That is it Jensen Hughes who actually performed it? Is there consistency there? Were there any surprises based on the study that was recently done?
I can take that. So we do have regular walkthroughs with the fire marshal, and he looks at a number of things, egress, a lot of code violations, if there's any. They look at emergency lighting. They look at all that. We also do, as part of our routine maintenance and scheduling, we do have all of our systems tested on an annual basis. All those reports do go to the fire marshal's office. So anything that is in need of modification or change or whatever, those are taken care of, and all those reports are sent back to him. So this report that Pam and her group did was looking at the age of the fire alarm systems, the programmability, the addressable qualities that they have, and the whole system, and just seeing them at the end of their life.
Right.
I would also add that we are also looking at beyond the 10-year span. And if you were to do a major renovation, what those other requirements would be. So it may be fine and you're following all the measures that are required by your fire marshal, but we're looking at what are the investments that you would definitely acquire if you're to do a major renovation, those expectations and those code implications if you were to do that. So we try and help broaden the window of when you're looking at those things.
Right. I appreciate that, Pamela and Joe. But I did read the report, and as I read through it, it did seem like there were some things that I don't think you used the word urgent, but seemed like they should be addressed in the short term. And obviously that could be a discussion for another day. But has this report been sent to the fire marshal, or should it, or not advisable?
It hasn't as yet.
So that at some point, Mr. Martieri will determine once we have a final report. Remember, these are still working drafts. Once we have a final report, it'll be shared out with the entire community. We work very closely with our fire marshal, so nothing there that we wouldn't share with him for sure.
Oh, okay. Oh, I thought the fire one was final. Okay, thank you.
I think I want to make sure like what they're as final as I think Pam has said, but as you noticed from even yesterday's report, some changes still have to be made. So we want to be sure that anything that's distributed publicly, like we're handing, is comprehensive and complete.
Got it. Thank you.
Can I just add one?
Oh, please go ahead. No, please go ahead. Sure.
So on the report, a lot of the fire and life safety lines, and Pam can attest to this. If we were to expand a non-sprinklered building, which we have several of those, code may dictate that we would have to put a sprinkler system in. So I just wanted to clarify that because some of that's a big number and it's looming out there in the report.
Yeah. And that would not be a surprise to your fire marshal, right? But the fire marshal is looking at existing building, existing use, existing system. So.
Thank you.
Mr. Siegel.
Sorry, I just took myself off mute there. So, yeah, I guess I am zooming out a little bit for just kind of, I feel like we're kind of at a moment right here where as I'm kind of pulling back to, we're talking about a very large number. I am thinking about what is practical and pragmatic here of, again, high level. As I'm looking at this and kind of digesting it, it is a misalignment of infrastructure as we look to the future, obviously. And I think that I'm bucketing this in a way of there's the kind of capacity, program delivery, and I guess that last bit is almost kind of maybe structural integrity is the way to look at that. So as I'm thinking about these things, and I'm sure we're all looking through the lens now of this kind of like incremental repair versus what is more of a structural redesign, if you will. One of the things that I want to understand is, so first, like, is there and this is probably jumping ahead, like an analysis on the inflection between the replacement and repair, bearing in mind, and I don't know how to kind of quantify this, that repair in this context sound like it's not as in consideration of program delivery quite as much. So if that is kind of the next step on where we're going, if you have a similar analysis for a peer district that we could review, because I think that one of the things that I'm trying to square is as we kind of look at, again, like not being penny wise, pound foolish, or just kind of plugging the dam versus we need to rebuild a dam here, how we think about weighing those and how we think about the kind of where almost it's that break-even analysis, if you will, on when it starts to make sense of over this horizon that we're looking at, considering things like program delivery and capacity when we have to kind of have those tough discussions about like kind of replacement versus repair and how we analyze that.
Hey, Pam and Mike, this is Phil. I have a suggestion on this last bullet point that says repair versus replacement. Keeping in line with what Scott just said, I almost think that the word renovate versus replacement is a better descriptor because then we can make that comparison between what is the value added benefit of renovating and the value added benefit of replacement, both from a infrastructure standpoint and an educationally programmatic standpoint. That's just one comment. That's all.
You're spot on, Phil and Scott. Thank you for bringing it up too as well, because as we kind of move along in the process, we're going to be wanting to weigh those things of, do we just follow our capital needs and address things as they come? Do we want to renovate a facility? In Connecticut, we have renovate as new statute. Do we want to replace a facility? And, when we get to that point in time in the option planning, we're going to want to be able to weigh it against those options, right? On what the benefits are, what the cons are, what the costs are, and what the implications are of being able to do all of those for a given approach, right? So I think we're kind of getting there, but I'm going to kind of keep trying to keep us grounded a little bit. I know we're at about 10 minutes left. We're probably going to run a little bit over. I do want to get into kind of big picture again, and I don't know if it's already been established for the committee, but I think we should revisit it if it has been. I know this is kind of like a restart of where you were at in the process. So we always like to be able to kind of challenge our members to put forth what we see as the biggest priorities as part of this process. So, you know, we're going to want to be able to have clear master planning goals. We're going to want to be able to have clear priorities to judge kind of like, are we in line? Because when we get into a master plan, we start throwing everything out there, right? Like everything out there gets thrown, and we need something to be able to kind of weigh that against. So, as we go through this process, we want to be able to have a clear goal in charge of the committee. Like, what are you really trying to accomplish with this? And then within that, we want to be able to understand, what are our key priorities? Because we're going to ultimately end up with about a half dozen or so, and sometimes when we're in the option planning, we find that we may have some that don't necessarily agree with each other when we're looking at a given option. So we want to be able to weigh those. So when we're working our way through, we want to be able to have this framework and guardrails to be able to put ourselves on as we're working our way through. And kind of talking about a big picture is one thing. We've pulled together several examples from recent projects that'll kind of get your thought process flowing so you could see what we've done in other communities recently and realize that, everybody had a slightly different goal. Some of these projects were more focused, some of them weren't as focused, and a little bit even bigger picture than where you're at. But ultimately, they all helped in kind of getting to that preferred option or options. So, we'll leave you with homework for our next meeting, which I believe is towards the end of April. But before we do that, we want to kind of walk and talk our way through what we've done in the past so you could kind of get a feel for that and how we incorporate it into this process. So with that, Pat, I'll put you back up on the mic. I know you led us through our Glastonbury facility plan last summer. So do you want to talk through the committee's approach there?
Sure. So, a lot of similarities to Ridgefield in that really the focus in Glastonbury, from an educational standpoint, was really addressing some capacity challenges at the elementary school. They were a little bit more pressed for space than you all, and so they had some short-term solutions that they were grappling with that they wanted to make sure aligned with any of their long-term changes. So I believe they ended up purchasing some modular classrooms to kind of hold them over until a larger building project could be completed. But we ended up establishing a number of criteria that we weighed our options against, creating parity in terms of educational program, aligning it with long-term enrollment trends, making sure that we have some space and flexibility for future program growth, demographic balance and community disruption. And probably the most important ones for Glastonbury and for most of the districts we work in now are really the fiscal responsibility indicators. They're a referendum community, and so ultimately they recognize that whatever projects move forward would have to ultimately have community support. And so having a lens of is this realistic really helped them with narrowing down their focus. And we provided some high order of magnitude costs to say, all right, is this going to be a 80 to 100 million dollar project, or is this going to be kind of a 5 to 10 million dollar project? Even though it wasn't super specific, it was a good enough range to help again narrow the thinking and give them a path forward that they feel can be successful.
Another example was in Bridgeport, which was a complete district-wide facility plan. We worked at that project with Studio Jade, doing the FCAs and doing all the capital planning. So, theirs were a little bit fuzzier because, there was just so much there trying to wrap it around very pointed priorities was a little bit more difficult there, especially working with the local board of education as well as the leadership team there. But ultimately, it came down to creating funding strategies for them, how best to be able to develop a targeted capital renewal plan. It also involved consolidation of very costly facilities. So recommendations were ultimately looking at ways to be able to seek opportunities to consolidate facilities. So getting into some cost avoidance, some building some new facilities to be able to still modernize education, be able to provide facilities for children and do it in a less costly manner than say, hey, we're going to renovate three small schools that really don't work because they're really kind of obsolete in form and very aged and have a lot of deferred maintenance, and accomplish that same task with building a new school. So, that was creating a roadmap and then really looking at funding strategies for them operationally to be able to kind of keep sustaining what they're doing. They're in a challenging environment there for funding of schools, both funding of school construction as well as funding for operations. And then last but not least, kind of like bringing the community along. A lot of different opinions there, a lot of different strong neighborhood groups there. So ultimately getting community support for both the short and long-term recommendations. Another example was a recently completed project, also working with Studio Jade on this one, with North Haven. This was focused on their elementary schools. Their high school is about 20 years old, beautiful facility. They recently did a renovate as new and expansion of the middle school on the high school site. So they've really kind of taken care of their upper grades, and it was time to be able to really address the elementary schools there. They hadn't done a major renovation project in the elementary schools, and over 20 years, they were similar vintage to some of your schools. Largely, their buildings were built about 50, 60 years ago, served them well. They're in good locations, but they really needed a plan to be able to modernize those facilities, bring them up to the standards of their middle school and high school. So they were getting a loss of students as they moved, moving into the community, saying, "Hey, our elementary schools really aren't matching up with, where we're at with high school," and then give them the framework for the next steps as they go through and look to be able to take care of each of those individual schools through construction projects. Pat, do you want to pop in and do New Canaan?
Sure. So New Canaan, similar process where, they're really focusing on addressing some capacity issues, but also looking at grade configurations. So they are one of the few remaining Durg A, B, C communities that has K-4 elementary schools, and they have a very large middle school that, they were cognizant of having, some loss of students as they transition to the middle school. Here we looked at the grade reconfiguration of their elementary schools, but without the space in the existing schools to do it, and without sites that are easily expandable, identified a new fourth school as really the only reasonable way to achieve the K-5 grade configuration. And again, having a partner who was able to provide some high-level costs and some architectural feasibility was instrumental in kind of the proof of concept to at least start those initial conversations.
Another example, this is from a couple of years ago, within the last 5 years, though, for Princeton, New Jersey. I've worked with Princeton Public Schools for, almost a decade now. This was leading them on a referendum which successfully passed for their elementary and middle schools. They had their neighborhood school base, but they also have magnet school, just kind of like a little bit of a magnet overlay on there. But really, it came down to a lot of development pressure, a lot more multifamily housing moving into the community. They wanted to be able to have a construction program there that passes muster. It's a very involved community to work in. But it's also, a very affluent and fiscally prudent community as well. So it really came down to cost effectiveness. Financial sustainability was really key, both operationally and from a construction cost standpoint. And with their neighborhood school model, they did want to improve walkability, reduce transportation. Traffic is a huge concern there. And ultimately find a better way to support their dual language integration or DLI program there. And kind of at their community park school, create a dual track school, which they've never had before, but really need it so that they didn't have a lot of outplay students going to the other schools within the community. And create attendance zones and a construction program that really set them up for success. Right now, they're in design. We'll be starting construction soon. Ultimately, we went through various different options there, and the community selected the option that best fit. And that was a project that moved forward. But it was key to be able to have the guardrails on that community because a lot of people had very strong opinions, and we wanted to be able to ensure that we had rationale for how we were working through the process. So, with that said, we have a meeting scheduled for the end of April. We'd like the committee to be able to kind of review some of the documentation that we reference, but really kind of focus on thinking about what is the major goals for this, right? And we find goals are clear, concise, simple, relatable to those in the public that aren't in our fields or fields. And then what are our priorities? So as you could see in the different examples that we worked our way through, each of those priorities we want to be able to identify clearly the considerations of how the options perform, how do they fit, and that'll give us our rationale for kind of working our way through and weeding our way through the process. So I mentioned earlier, probably on slide 3 or 4, we're going to start big picture. We're going to throw a lot of things at the wall, see what sticks, see what kind of fits with what our priorities are, narrow it down, and then start to study in detail those options that those narrowed down options, which we see as having the most potential for the best fit. So, we'd like the committee members to be able to, put their thoughts together, come back at our next meeting. We're going to want to be able to discuss and kind of codify what the master planning goals and priorities are. At that meeting, we're also going to brainstorm on those high level options. What do we want to look at? How do those options fit within the context of those goals and priorities? And how does that fit within some of the analysis that we're going to do, in particular, the site analysis, the feasibility of expansions, to further kind of ground that. And then that'll really set us up for our next meeting in June, where we're going to go through the review of those initial options, see what kind of works, see what doesn't work, set up our meeting schedule going on past this with the ultimate goal of having this kind of, recommendations towards the fall, but then really kind of set us up in the summer where as your design and project team, we're going to be doing the more detailed conceptual block diagrams, putting together the cost estimates of what those handful of options really need to look like. So I think, we're almost right on schedule, but we're going to leave you with kind of that homework. You have a copy of this slide deck as well, hopefully, that you could kind of take a look at those options, get a good understanding, and, come back to us and say, hey, here's what we really want to be able to kind of prioritize on. Here's my thoughts. Here's the priorities. We're going to mix them all together and agree on that. This is where we kind of think they stand now, because without that framework, the master planning takes a lot longer, as well as this saves us a lot of time of looking at things that really don't fit with where you want to be from a facility and educational standpoint. So with that, I'll put it back over to anybody if they have any questions, comments, anything they'd like to add before we kind of break for the meeting.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zuba and team. This was just an incredibly comprehensive and helpful analysis and presentation of the work that's been done. Tremendous amount of work. Appreciate it. Lots of work to come. Do any committee members have questions or comments before we break? Otherwise, I'm going to give Dr. De Silva a chance to, Mr. Martiri, please.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand the homework assignment. Are you asking the committee to come back with options on how we ought to proceed? For example, consolidate this school into that school, or I just want to make sure what options or what you're actually asking us to do.
We're asking you to kind of come back to us and say, as part of this process, what is your goal at the end of the day? So what is the big picture goal for Richfield Public Schools with this master plan? Is it to improve all facilities? Is it to create a framework for operating more efficiently? Is it a framework to do all of those things, some of those things, none of those things? We're not going to get into suggestions yet on closing the school, building a bigger school. That's to come. What we're saying is, big picture wise, where do you see the biggest needs that are going to come out of this thing? Like, a master plan could be anything and everything. We're challenging you to come up with saying, at the end of the day, with this plan, we're going to achieve what?
Okay, got it.
And
Thank
then the second part of that would be, based on that, what are things that are important to you as the committee, the board, and the community? Is it, as Pat mentioned, I think Glastonbury is a great example. How should we, what lens should we put to each one of these? Is it, educational program needs? Probably. Is it fiscal operational responsibility? So are we looking at designing a school system that is going to be more resilient to budget swings, costs? Like, we can't control certain things like contracting and unions and the like, but what we can control and what we can look at is, are we operating our buildings as efficiently as possible based on our structure and size? Is that important? Or is maintaining the long-standing neighborhood elementary schools the most important? Is maintaining the current grade configuration a high priority, or is it not a high priority, right? Like, so that'll be all very, very helpful information for us before we just start taking things and putting it out there into the ether.
Ms. Kraft?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ms. Kraft, did you have a comment or a question?
Nope, I'm all set. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
Okay.
Dr. De Silva, thoughts?
So quick question for Mike and Pam. When it comes to the energy study, is that okay to come in May, or should we be having that information prior to our April meeting? Or at least the report in their hand?
No, you'll have the report.
So the report in their hand before the April meeting, not necessary to have the full comprehensive as you gave us yesterday.
They'll have, in my mind, they will have the report and could potentially also have the conversation if you wanted to review it as well.
But it's not 100% necessary for the April meeting. Mike? No.
It's not, but I think it's really going to come down to timing. So that April meeting, I assume we're going to have about an hour and a half as well.
Yes.
In my experience, the goals and strategies and prioritization, it's going to take a chunk of that. And then what we're really going to want to do as well at that next meeting, so just kind of planning our time, we're going to brainstorm. So we're going to do probably an intense half hour of brainstorming on options with you, of things that we want to throw out there, right, to look at. So in thinking about that, it's probably going to eat up a chunk of the meeting, Pam. I don't know how long you typically. Yeah.
So
energy sounds like it's a mouthful, right? Like
it is a mouthful, but what I would say is, again, the energy analysis helps provide a framework for understanding of where you are, right? So it's a parallel to existing building conditions. What you're referring to, Dr. Silva, is actually what is part of next steps, is the implications of layering that on top of options that are developed. So there are two pieces to that. So the report will be out, so you have that for consumption.
Good enough. And just to clarify, the meeting, Mike, is April 24th. It's the Friday, not the Thursday.
Oh, I have the wrong date on there. I'm sorry. I'll change it.
I appreciate that. And I think that's it for me for now. I know we have another meeting happening almost right now.
Sorry about that running over.
Right. No.
I had it April 23rd. By the way, the meeting invite, I think, is April 23rd.
Oh boy. All right. Well, we'll
Thursday.
double check that. I think we're on the 24th though, but I'll double check.
We'll figure it out.
Thank you all for this incredibly useful session. With that, I'm going to entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
So moved, and we have a second. All in favor? We're going to do a voice vote. Ms. Graff?
Yes.
Mr. Siegel?
Yes.
Mr. Martieri?
Yes.
And I'm a yes. We are adjourned.